The sun rose over the rolling hills of the Ozarks, casting a golden hue upon the rugged landscape that a man named Jed called home. To understand the man, one must first understand the soil from which he sprang. Jed was a mountaineer of the purest sort, a soul bound to the earth and the seasons. He was a man of quiet dignity, though his pockets were often as empty as a dry creek bed in the heat of August. For many years, he struggled with a humble persistence, barely keeping his kinfolk fed with what he could glean from the woods and the small patches of workable land. Then came the day that changed the course of history for the Clampett family. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. Jed had taken his old rifle into the woods, his eyes keen for the movement of small game that might provide a supper for his table. He spotted his quarry and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out through the trees, but instead of the expected result, the ground itself seemed to respond with a gurgling groan. From the very earth where his bullet had struck, a dark and viscous liquid began to bubble and seep. It was crude oil, the black gold that the world outside the hills craved with a feverish intensity. Some called it Texas tea, and in that singular moment, the poor mountaineer became a man of immense wealth. The news spread through the hills like a wildfire. His kinfolk gathered, their eyes wide with wonder and a touch of restless ambition. They told him that a millionaire had no business staying in a shack when the world was wide and full of wonders. They pointed toward the west, toward the land of sunshine and dreams. California, they said, was the place where a man of his standing ought to be. And so, with a mixture of reluctance and excitement, they loaded up their ancient truck with every possession they owned, from the rocking chairs to the iron pots, and began the long journey. They moved to Beverly Hills, a place of swimming pools and movie stars, bringing their mountain heart to the center of modern luxury. On a bright morning in their new palatial estate, the air was filled with the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of lawnmowers. Within the grand foyer, Miss Jane Hathaway and Mr. Milburn Drysdale were preparing for an event of some significance. Miss Jane, the ever-efficient secretary, smoothed her skirts while Mr. Drysdale, the banker whose heart beat in rhythm with the stock market, adjusted his tie. Jed greeted them with his characteristic warmth. He invited them in, his voice a steady rumble of hospitality. Miss Jane remarked on how fine and dandy everyone looked, noticing that the family was dressed in their absolute best. Mr. Drysdale explained that they were there to greet the mayor of Silver Dollar City, who was scheduled to arrive that very morning. The family had already gone to the airport to fetch him, leaving Jed to hold the fort. Mr. Drysdale held up a gleaming object. It was a ceremonial key, polished to a high shine. He explained that it was the key to the city of Beverly Hills, a symbolic gesture of welcome for Mayor Shad Heller. Jed looked at the key with a puzzled expression, remarking that they must have a mighty big lock on the town if that was the size of the key required. Miss Jane clarified that it was merely a symbol, one that the chief would present to the mayor. Jed cautioned them not to make too much of a fuss, fearing that Shad might get flustered. He spoke of Shad Heller with deep respect, noting that he was not only the mayor but also the town blacksmith. He shared a story of Shad's bravery, recounting the time Shad had shoed a full-grown elephant. When Mr. Drysdale expressed disbelief, Jed explained that the elephant had escaped from a circus and wandered into Shad's cabbage patch. Shad had simply shooed him away, though in the retelling, Shad often left out the part about the cabbage patch to make it sound more heroic. The conversation shifted to the domestic troubles at the Clampett mansion. Jed mentioned that Granny was staying behind to guard the house because of a string of robberies. Miss Jane was horrified to hear that something was being taken every single night. When the family finally returned from the airport with Mayor Heller in tow, the introductions were made with great ceremony. Shad Heller was a man of solid build, his hands showing the calluses of a lifetime at the forge. Mr. Drysdale began his formal speech on behalf of the city and the Commerce Bank, but Shad was more interested in the talk of robberies. He shook hands with the banker and the secretary, but his mind was on the culprit who was pilfering from his friends. Miss Jane was particularly taken by the mayor, remembering the sight of him working at his forge in Silver Dollar City. She described the way he shaped red-hot steel on his anvil with his large, sinewy hands and mighty arms. Shad asked for details on what had been stolen. Jed listed the losses: a jar of pickled owl gizzards, some hickory-smoked possum shanks, and a jar of minced paws. To the sophisticated ears of the Beverly Hills residents, these items sounded exotic, perhaps even baffling, but to the folks from the hills, they were precious staples of the larder. Granny appeared, her face set in a mask of determination. She was ready to feed the young ones, provided the thieves had not taken every morsel. Jed invited Mr. Drysdale and Miss Jane to stay for a meal, offering some goat cheese that had been aging in the root cellar for 8 long years. He joked that if the cheese was gone, it must have gotten up and walked away on its own legs. The bank officials politely declined, citing the press of business, though the mention of 8-year-old goat cheese may have played a role in their hasty departure. As the guests left, Jed and Shad began to discuss an old friend named Shorty Callums. Jed asked if Shorty had settled down after returning home from his previous visit to California. Shad revealed that Shorty had never actually made it back to the hills. This news troubled Jed, who recalled how Shorty had gone wild in Hollywood, staying up all night and chasing after women who were twice his size. Shorty had been a man possessed by the bright lights and the fast pace of the city. Jed confessed that he had tried to help Shorty by advising him to marry a girl from the hills and settle down on his father's farm. Shorty had taken the advice to heart and written a proposal note, but in his excitement or perhaps his confusion, he had slipped it under the wrong door. Instead of reaching Ellie Mae, the note had found its way to Granny. Jed had used this mistake to give Shorty a good scare, hoping to drive him back to a more sensible life. He had teased Shorty about the prospect of marrying Granny until the poor man had fled in a panic. Suddenly, a commotion erupted. Granny shouted that the root cellar thief had struck again. This time, even the infamous goat cheese was gone. Jed and Shad decided it was time to track down the rascal. They armed themselves and headed toward the cellar, expecting to find a desperate criminal. Instead, they found a familiar figure cowering in the shadows. It was Shorty Callums. Shorty was a pathetic sight, his clothes dusty and his eyes wide with fear. He begged them not to shoot, declaring that he was unarmed. He explained that he had been hiding in the root cellar for 4 weeks, surviving on the food he had scavenged from Granny's supplies. The fear of Granny finding his proposal note and holding him to it had kept him paralyzed. He was too scared to go home and too scared to stay. Jed laughed gently and delivered the good news. Granny had never seen the proposal. He had only told Shorty that to teach him a lesson about his wild behavior. Shorty was immensely relieved, though he admitted that the weeks of praying and repenting in the cellar had given him a considerable appetite. He had spent his time snacking, snoozing, and sipping on some jugs that Granny had left behind. Granny arrived on the scene, her suspicions still high. Jed quickly covered for Shorty, claiming that Shorty had caught the robber and scared him away for good. Granny was impressed, glad to see Shorty doing something productive instead of chasing women. Shorty, feeling the weight of his sins lift, promised to mend his ways. He was hungry and asked for some sausages before turning in for the night. The next morning, Jed and Shad sat together, pondering the future of their friend. Shad mentioned that Shorty had spent over 30 years running the Silver Dollar City Hotel and that it would be a fine thing if he could buy it back. However, the hotel had been sold to a woman named Alverna Bradshaw. Jed winced at the name, knowing that Granny and Alverna had a long history of rivalry. They had once had a legendary confrontation in the hotel lobby, where insults about wrinkles and age had flown like sparks from a blacksmith's anvil. Despite the rivalry, Shad noted that Alverna was a hard worker who had beautified the hotel and even won a beauty contest for her efforts. They devised a plan to convince Shorty that Alverna had become a true beauty, hoping that a marriage between the two would secure Shorty's future and the hotel. They spoke loudly within Shorty's earshot, describing Alverna as a woman who had ripened to perfection and won contests hands down. Shorty was intrigued. He had always thought Alverna had potential, and the idea of being alone on a desert island with her suddenly seemed appealing. Jed called Alverna to negotiate the sale of the hotel, but she was firm. She told him that the only way Shorty would ever get his hands on that hotel again was if he married her. Shorty, however, was not yet convinced. He initially rejected the idea with a sharp remark, but the seeds of interest had been planted. To further the scheme, Jed and Shad began to point out the striking resemblance between Ellie Mae and the supposed new version of Alverna. They claimed they could be twin sisters. Shorty started to believe that he might be missing out on a grand opportunity. He decided to make the call himself and agree to the union. The news of the impending marriage did not sit well with Granny. She viewed Alverna as a wicked woman, a vampire bat who had been biting people since she was a year old. She tried to convince Jethro to push Shorty's car off a cliff to save him from such a fate, believing it would be a more merciful end. Despite Granny's protests, the plan moved forward. Alverna was invited to California, and Shorty was eager to take her to Las Vegas to tie the knot quickly. He was convinced he was marrying a beauty queen. When Alverna arrived, she was indeed well-dressed and ready for the adventure. Shorty was in a state of romantic fervor, calling himself a mad, impetuous boy. However, as they prepared to depart, a young woman named Gloria appeared. She was a sophisticated girl from the bank, carrying papers for Mr. Clampett. Shorty, seeing her, felt the old Hollywood spark reignite. His resolve to marry Alverna began to waver as he looked at the cute little rascal before him. Gloria invited him for a drive, and Shorty, forgetting his promises and his plans for the hotel, eagerly followed her. The story of the Clampetts and their friends from the hills continued to unfold in the sprawling sunshine of Beverly Hills. It was a place of strange customs and fancy gadgets, but the heart of the family remained unchanged. They navigated the complexities of their new life with a blend of mountain wisdom and innocent charm, always finding the humor in their situation and the value in their friendships. In the end, whether it was a key to a city or a jar of pickled gizzards, the true wealth they possessed was the bond they shared and the laughter that filled their home.